To understand the history of typography, it's necessary to go way, way back to prehistoric times where the primary form of communication was visual. And what we're looking at here is probably a reproduction, but it is an evidence of the cave paintings that were the way that prehistoric peoples communicated with one another. And these are all over Europe, largely and most famously in France. And again, this is probably a reproduction, but this is what the prehistoric peoples would use on the cave walls to determine fertile hunting grounds, to communicate nature of what has been hunted and killed. And it's actually quite a detailed and nicely rendered depiction of an animal, probably a horse or some type of beast. And above the image of the animal, you see scratchings or markings in the rock that very likely were used to communicate as well, and which then later developed into the letter forms that we know today. So that's where it started, and then it developed into something similar to this. Now this is a modern reproduction of what we call a pictograph, and you can see there's no detail in it. The details are gone, the color is gone, and this is of course very rough. But you get the idea of what's being communicated here. We see an animal shape, and then we see a human shape with a lasso, which is indicating hunting or capturing. So the idea of communicating an idea has been really developed and simplified into what we call a pictograph. And of course we all recognize this image, and it is something used today to indicate a male figure, most often used on restrooms. And you don't have to read English or know French or know a language to understand what this is. So communicating with pictures is how typography really began, and it did develop into more abstract letter forms over the centuries. And this is a good simple example of how these forms developed. Pictographs are where it started. You can see images of animals and a human figure here. And then the Phoenicians, which were a civilization that was very developed, and this was in the Middle East, what is now the Middle East, and we're talking 1500 BC on up to about 300 or 400 BC. The Phoenicians were a very cultured people. They were a trading people. They did business, and these letter forms were taken and developed from the pictographs, probably for ease of writing and ease of use, creating them quickly. But they started to become the more abstract letter forms that we know today. Further development happened over the centuries by the Greeks. You can see the further development here. And then the Romans really started to develop these letter forms and stylize them into what we recognize today. So here are some quick examples of other types of communication. This is an example of Egyptian hieroglyphics. You can see the pictographic nature of the letter forms here and the kind of handwritten look. Sumerian letter forms, Sumeria is in what is now Iraq, again in that Mesopotamian Middle Eastern area, and they are communicating on tablets using hieroglyphic type imagery and forms as well. And papyrus is being created and written on. Papyrus is made from reeds, and it's an early form of paper. So you can see that writing is going on 2000 BC, this is dated at. And also in China, we have real development of typography and writing, calligraphy, and technology going on in the Far East. And as time goes on, you can see that the Greek letters, these are the Greek version of the Phoenician letters, we're getting into stone carving, and you can see a real uniformity of the letter forms, and alignments and spacing are being considered here. The Romans, of course, are taking these letter forms and making them even more uniform and more even, and the picture isn't very good quality. Apologize for that, but you can see that again, the uniformity is really paramount. And some people believe that the development of what we know as serifs first came from these Roman stone carvings, where the chisel was to end the stroke, the stone carver had to tilt the chisel to get it out of the stone, thereby creating these little ticks which become the serifs. So some people believe that is how the serif idea first became developed, through stone carving. In the northern part of Europe, in the Celtic countries of Ireland, Scotland, parts of England, you start to see, and this would be about 100 or 200 BC, you start to see a letter form called uncials, and here are examples of them. And they are a much more rounded and decorative and very pleasing looking type style that was developed in that part of Europe. And they have a distinctive kind of an Irish or Celtic feel to them. They're called uncials. And then in Germany, in other parts of England rather, you start to see this dark, dense style. We know it as Gothic or Old English. It's known as black letter, and it's a very dense, dark typeface. This is what Gutenberg used for his Bible, his first printed book, and it is a very distinctive style used to some degree today, although it's really not that readable. Here's an example of a movable type piece used in China. They were starting to develop their own methods and technology of type and printing, kind of separate from what Europe was doing, and it wasn't till centuries later that the Far East and the Western world really started to combine and share their achievements together. Here's another example of the Uncial typeface style, and it's much more easy to read than the black letter style. Here's a fairly dark image, kind of hard to see, but an example of one of the first printed books in the 1400s. And printed books took forever to create because every letter and every line of text had to be set by hand in a type case and then inked and printed. And then this particular page has lots of beautiful, dense illustrations. So it took years and years for a book to be developed, and therefore were very prized and are certainly still prized today. Here's an example of something called an illuminated manuscript. You see the black letter styling, and there's some attempt at readability with a short line length and organized columns, but what makes this page so beautiful is the decoration around the edges of the page, and the beautiful inks are used. And the reason that it's called illuminated is because a lot of times gold leaf would be used on these decorative elements, and the gold, of course, shines and glows, and that's said to have been the illuminated manuscript by the use of gold. Here's a picture of the type of printing press that Gutenberg used back in the 1400s, and this was the press that was used to print the very first printed book in the Western world, which was the Gutenberg Bible. And this is likely what the Bible page looked like. Lots of dense black letter text in fairly easy to read columns, but you can tell why it's called black letter. Very, very dense and tough to read. Now, this is skipping ahead a little bit, but a couple of hundred years later, the end of the 1600s, letter forms started to be really studied as engineered forms. And you can see from this drawing that the typefaces, the people that were designing the typefaces at the end of the 1600s were really taking into account the curves and the angles and the arcs and the thick and thin parts of the letter forms. And this is where the art and study of typography really started to come into play. And you see how intricate and exacting the art is. And this is what people consider today when they're designing typefaces. They do it digitally, of course, but it's very, very exacting and very engineered. And to end this video, I'm going to show an example of Caslon, the typeface. This would have been the early 1700s, and William Caslon designed this face, which is used still today. You can see how beautifully rounded and easy it is to read, and how the different styles are created. There's italics here, there's upper and lowercase capital letters, not lowercase, but small caps, large and small capital letters. And this is where the engineering aspect of the letter forms really start to play forward. And we're at the 1700s now. In subsequent videos, I will talk about how type further developed and developed up until what we know today. Thanks.